The road looked harmless, a thin dirt line between wet brush, and the rain was so steady it felt ordinary, until the headlights caught a shine that didn't belong, a flat mirror spreading across the track, expecting frogs, wind, anything, but hearing only a low, patient movement beneath them, like water pulling stones out of place. And Lena understood the trap wasn't a crash. It was time, because nothing was happening fast enough to scare them. Yet every second quietly erased another option, and the dark kept acting like it had all night to win. March 2003, northern San Diego County, the kind of evening that starts as just rain and turns serious by inches. Evan and Lena left the highway for a shortcut that looked safe on a folded map, and even safer under headlights. A maintenance road, packed dirt, shallow ruts, brush on both sides, no signs, no houses, and the steady drizzle made everything shine as if it were sealed. So when the tires rolled into the first sheet of water, it seemed like nothing, a thin spill across the track, and Evan kept the wheels straight, barely above walking speed, listening for slippage, feeling for the bite of gravel, while Lena watched the right shoulder for a dry line, for any hint of depth. And then the car settled a fraction lower than it should have. Not a jolt, more like a slow exhale, and the water touched the doors, cold enough to make her toes tighten inside her shoes, and she said, quietly and clearly, "Stop," as if the word itself could hold the car in place. He stopped, and for a moment the only motion was the rain on the roof and the faint drift of water around the tires. And that stillness tried to lie to them, tried to suggest they could wait, and it would pass. But the air inside already felt different, damp, heavy, and the road behind them was a black ribbon with no edges, because the rain erased the ditch line and the headlights couldn't reach the turn they'd taken. And Lena's phone showed one weak bar that vanished when she tried to call, and Evan's did the same, each screen bright for a second, then useless. And they both understood the first rule without saying it. Conserve power, conserve breath, conserve mistakes. So they made small moves only. Lena loosened her seatbelt so it wouldn't trap her if the car shifted. Evan slid his wallet and keys into his jacket pocket, then placed the jacket on his lap, as if readiness was something you could fold, and he did not restart the engine, because he could feel the water pressing under the chassis, and he'd heard what happens when an engine drinks. The water rose in a way that felt unfair, slow enough to invite denial, steady enough to punish it. And when Evan cracked his door an inch to test, the pressure pushed back. Then a thin surge slipped in, ice cold, fast, stealing heat, and he shut it again, swallowing the urge to slam anything, because noise would not change physics. And Lena leaned forward to look through the windshield, trying to read the surface like a map, watching for leaves, foam, ripples, anything that revealed direction. And she noticed a faint diagonal pull, right to left, which meant the road was no longer the lowest point. The road was becoming a channel, and channels always decide for you eventually. And neither of them said the word flood, because naming it made it real, and making it real made the next choice unavoidable. Evan looked at the dashboard clock, then at Lena, and they agreed without words to count 10 minutes, not for hope, for data, and stay very still. The 10 minutes stretched immediately, not because time slowed, but because every sense sharpened and refused to let anything pass unnoticed. The water pressing harder now against the underside of the car, tapping and sliding with a soft persistence that made it impossible to forget it was there. And Lena felt the cold seep higher, soaking into the floor, numbing her feet unevenly, left before right, which told her the car was no longer level, that one side was sinking faster than the other, and she shifted her weight instinctively, then froze, afraid that even a small movement might encourage the ground beneath them to give up completely. Evan kept his hands on the steering wheel even though the engine was off, fingers resting lightly as if he could feel the road through it. And every so often the car responded with a faint sway, not rocking exactly, more like settling, a slow adjustment that never quite finished. And each time it happened, his jaw tightened, because settling meant change, and change meant they were no longer parked on something solid, just something pretending to be. The rain intensified without warning, not louder but thicker, turning the windshield into a moving blur, and when Lena wiped a small clear patch with her sleeve, she saw the water ahead pulling sideways, dragging leaves and grit across the road, confirming what she already suspected, that the path they had driven on was being quietly reshaped into something else. They tried the phones again, not speaking while they did it, both screens lighting their faces pale and strained, one bar appearing and vanishing like a mistake, and when nothing connected, Lena powered hers down completely, a deliberate choice that made her stomach tighten, because it meant accepting that help, if it came, would not be summoned, only encountered. Evan watched the clock tick past their 10-minute mark and didn't say anything, because the number had stopped being useful, the data already collected, water rising, pressure increasing, the car shifting in tiny, measurable ways, and beyond the headlights, somewhere in the dark, the road was deciding how much longer it would exist. A dull sound rolled through the ground ahead, not loud enough to startle, but deep enough to feel, like a heavy object being dragged slowly across earth, and Lena leaned forward, listening hard, her breath shallow, and when the sound came again, closer this time, Evan knew waiting had ended, even if they hadn't said so yet. He reached for the door handle and paused, feeling the resistance through the metal, the weight of water holding it shut, and in that pause, both of them understood the next choice would not be reversible, that once they committed to movement, there would be no safe stillness left to return to. Evan opened the door in slow increments, stopping after each inch, feeling the pressure through the metal before committing to the next, and when the water finally forced its way inside, it did so with intent, cold and heavy, wrapping around his shin and pulling sideways hard enough to shift his balance, and the car answered with a deeper tilt, not sudden, but final, the kind of movement that tells you something underneath has stopped pretending to hold. He shut the door again, chest tight, breath short, rain streaking through the crack before it sealed, and for a moment they stayed exactly where they were, water sloshing around their feet, the floor no longer level, the space inside shrinking. And Lena understood that staying seated was no longer a neutral choice. It was an active risk. They moved with quiet urgency, no wasted motion. Lena slipped her backpack on, cinched the straps, lifted her feet one at a time to free them from suction she hadn't noticed building, while Evan checked the flashlight again, then the door, then the angle of the road behind them, measuring slope by instinct more than sight. And when he opened the door for good, the water surged in fast, knee-high immediately, the current strong enough to steal warmth and confidence at the same time, and he stepped out sideways, bracing, waiting for the pull to settle before shifting weight, because rushing here would mean falling, and falling would mean being taken. Lena followed on his count, timing her movement to his pause, the cold biting hard enough to make her gasp despite herself. The ground beneath her feet uneven and invisible. Stones rolling, mud collapsing in small, dangerous increments, and they stayed close to the car, hands brushing the metal as if it could still anchor them. Even as it leaned further, the sound of straining steel soft but unmistakable. And when Evan swept the flashlight forward, the beam revealed the road ahead torn open, its edge jagged and raw, water pouring through it in a constant sheet, carrying earth with it, erasing the path they had trusted minutes earlier. Lena didn't argue or hesitate. She pointed back the way they'd come, where the slope rose slightly and the current felt weaker against her calves, and Evan nodded, because the decision had already been made by the water, and all that remained was timing, when to move, how fast, and how to keep their feet under them as the car shifted again behind them, settling lower, claiming its last moments of balance, and they turned away together, stepping into the darkness, knowing that once they let go of the vehicle, there would be no solid thing left to return to. They moved backward into the darkness one step at a time, not turning fully away from the car at first, because letting it out of sight felt like surrendering the last fixed point they had, and the water resisted every movement, pressing against their calves and knees with uneven force, stronger in brief pulses that made Evan pause and brace, testing the ground with his foot before committing his weight, because the surface kept changing, firm gravel becoming soft mud without warning, mud giving way to nothing for half a second before finding resistance again, and each misstep sent a sharp jolt of fear through his chest that he forced down by slowing even more. Lena stayed slightly ahead now, not by plan but by instinct, her eyes fixed on the faint suggestion of higher ground she could feel more than see, the pull of the current easing by degrees as they climbed, and she used her free hand to sweep low in front of her, not searching for obstacles but for absence, for that sudden lack of resistance that meant the road edge was gone, and when her foot slipped sideways into colder, faster water, she stopped instantly, didn't pull back, didn't panic, just froze, until Evan stepped closer and shifted his weight to counterbalance her, both of them holding still until the ground decided whether it would keep them. Behind them, the car made a sound that neither of them wanted to name, a long, strained groan followed by a deeper settling, and they felt it through their feet as much as they heard it, the vibration traveling through the water and into their legs, telling them the vehicle was changing position, losing whatever fragile balance it had left, and Evan forced himself not to look, because watching it move would steal focus from the ground in front of him, and the ground was now the only thing that mattered. The rain shifted again, driven sideways by a gust that flattened it against their faces and blurred what little visibility they had, and Lena felt fatigue creep in, not the kind that makes you weak, but the kind that makes you careless, that tempts you to speed up just to get it over with. And she fought it by counting steps in her head, 5 at a time, pause, 5 more, pause, anchoring herself to rhythm instead of fear, because rhythm could be trusted when instincts couldn't. When the current suddenly weakened around her ankles, she almost didn't believe it, waiting for the pull to return, and when it didn't, she lowered her foot again, feeling packed earth instead of sliding stone, and she raised her arm slightly, a silent signal. And Evan felt the change too, the water loosening its grip, the ground pushing back at last, and they moved the final stretch carefully, not rushing the relief, until the slope leveled and they stood on something that held their full weight without argument, soaked, shaking, breathing hard, knowing they were not safe yet, but aware that for the first time since stopping the car, the ground beneath them was no longer trying to disappear. They stayed still longer than comfort allowed, letting their bodies recalibrate to ground that didn't slide or pull. Rain still pressing down, but no longer dictating every movement. And in that pause, the reality of exposure settled in. Clothes soaked through, legs numb from cold, hands clumsy, and the awareness that stopping here for too long would invite a different kind of danger, exhaustion that dulled judgment. So Evan shifted his weight slowly, testing again, and Lena scanned the darkness ahead, not for a destination, but for continuity, for any sign that the higher ground extended instead of narrowing into another trap. They moved forward cautiously, no longer fighting a current, but navigating instability. The road surface cracked and uneven, sections undermined where water had hollowed it out from below. And every few steps, Lena felt a faint give under her boot, not enough to break through, but enough to force a pause, and Evan adjusted their path slightly each time, angling them toward the center where the ground felt denser, and they spoke in short, clipped phrases when they spoke at all. Warnings more than conversation, soft, hold, wait, because anything longer risked distraction. The rain eased just enough to change the soundscape, individual drops becoming distinguishable, and with that change came new noises. Water still moving below them, but also distant cracking, small collapses out of sight, earth continuing to fail in pieces, and Lena realized how misleading stillness could be, how a place could feel momentarily stable while actively coming apart around you. And that understanding sharpened her focus, kept her from relaxing into the false safety of higher ground. They reached a stretch where the road narrowed between brush, the edges masked by grass and shadow. And Evan slowed further, probing with his foot before each step, because here the collapse would be hidden until it wasn't. And when his foot sank unexpectedly, not deep, just enough to catch, his heart jumped hard enough to make him stop breathing for a second, and Lena steadied him without a word, both of them frozen until he eased his weight back and found firmer footing again. Beyond that point, the slope rose a little more, the ground gradually asserting itself, and although the rain continued, its authority weakened, becoming background instead of command, and they moved on, muscles burning now, fatigue threading through every motion, aware that the night wasn't finished testing them, only changing how it applied pressure. And as they crested another slight rise, Lena caught sight of a faint reflective line ahead. Not light exactly, but pavement catching what little glow the clouds allowed. And she didn't point it out yet, didn't want to name hope before it proved real. So they kept moving, slow and deliberate, carrying the knowledge that even here, even now, the margin was still thin, and attention was the only thing keeping it intact. They followed the faint suggestion of pavement without acknowledging it out loud, because saying it would make it fragile, and instead they treated it like any other uncertainty. Something to be tested slowly, step by step, the rain still slicking the surface, the wind pressing cool against their wet clothes, and as they moved closer, the ground firmed underfoot in uneven patches, alternating between solid and compromised, forcing constant adjustments, Evan leading with his weight low and centered, Lena watching the edges for subtle drops where the road might be hollowed out beneath a thin skin of dirt. When they finally reached the pavement, it wasn't intact the way they'd hoped, cracked and buckled in places, sloping unpredictably, but it held, and that mattered more than appearance. And they paused there, not resting fully, just long enough to reset their balance, because stopping completely invited stiffness, invited shaking, and Lena felt her hands begin to tremble despite her effort to stay composed. A delayed response to cold and strain, and she clenched them into fists until sensation returned in uneven pulses. The road curved gently ahead, disappearing into darkness again, and with no clear sense of how far it ran or where it led, they chose direction by elevation, moving uphill whenever the option presented itself, trusting gravity more than instinct, and the rain thinned further, not stopping but loosening its grip, allowing the sounds of the night to separate again, wind in brush, distant water still moving below, and the faint creak of stressed ground somewhere behind them, reminding them that the collapse was ongoing, even if they were no longer in its center. Fatigue began to press harder now, not dramatic, but persistent, a dull resistance in their legs, a narrowing of focus that made everything beyond the next few steps feel abstract. And Evan recognized the danger in that, the way tiredness encourages shortcuts, and he slowed them deliberately, forcing regular pauses, not long enough to chill, just long enough to breathe, to look, to confirm that the ground ahead still made sense. At one of those pauses, Lena noticed a new sound layered under the rain, a low, steady hum that didn't belong to water or wind, distant but consistent, and she tilted her head, listening, unsure whether it was real or imagined, and when it persisted, unchanged by gusts or terrain, she felt a cautious alertness sharpen her focus again, because the night was no longer completely empty, and whatever lay ahead was beginning to announce itself, faintly, without yet revealing whether it would bring danger or relief. The low hum stayed with them as they moved, never growing louder, never fading, a constant thread woven through the rain and wind, and that consistency made it unsettling, because it suggested something active, something powered, operating independently of the storm. And Evan found himself adjusting their path slightly toward it without fully deciding to, choosing routes that kept them climbing but also drifting closer, while Lena watched his shoulders tense, aware that attention was being pulled in two directions now, survival underfoot and uncertainty ahead. The pavement degraded again as they followed the curve, breaking into patches where dirt had crept back over the surface, disguising cracks and shallow voids. And Lena tested each questionable section with the toe of her boot before committing, feeling for that subtle give that warned of collapse. And twice she stopped them completely, holding up a hand when the texture underfoot changed too abruptly, because abruptness was how the night had tried to trap them before, and she refused to let it do so again. The hum resolved slightly as they crested a rise, no longer just sound but vibration, a faint tremor through the soles of their feet, and with it came a new complication. Light, not bright, not direct, but a pale, shifting glow reflected low against the clouds, distant and unstable. And Evan slowed immediately, because light could mean many things: a structure, a road, machinery, or simply something else being swept along by water, and approaching it without understanding felt reckless. They stopped beneath a stand of low trees that offered minimal shelter but broke the wind, rain tapping steadily through leaves. And there, standing still, fatigue surged forward, demanding attention, muscles aching sharply now that motion had paused, and Lena leaned one shoulder against a trunk, eyes closed for just a second, forcing herself to breathe evenly, because this was another kind of risk, resting too long, letting the body decide it was done before safety had been reached. The ground beneath them vibrated again, stronger this time, the hum dipping slightly in pitch, and Evan felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same sensation he'd had before the road gave way, when something solid began to behave like something temporary, and he shifted his weight instinctively, scanning the ground. But the vibration wasn't coming from below. It was moving across the landscape, passing somewhere beyond the trees, unseen. And that movement changed everything, because now whatever shared the night with them was not fixed in place. It was traveling, and whether it would intersect their path was no longer something they could control. They waited under the trees longer than either intended, not because they wanted rest, but because movement suddenly felt like a decision with consequences again. And the hum continued to pass through the night at irregular intervals, sometimes closer, sometimes fading, never revealing its source. And that uncertainty pressed on them harder than the water had, because water followed rules they could feel: gravity, slope, force, while this was something external, moving by its own logic, indifferent to where they stood. Evan shifted his stance, testing the ground once more, and realized the vibration wasn't affecting the surface beneath them at all, which meant the danger here wasn't collapse. It was intersection, being in the wrong place when whatever was out there arrived. They moved again, angling away from the trees and back toward the road's faint outline, choosing openness over concealment, because hiding made it harder to see what was coming. And as they stepped out, the glow in the clouds strengthened briefly, reflecting off wet pavement ahead, then dimmed, and Lena felt her pulse quicken, not from fear exactly, but from anticipation, the mind preparing for contact of some kind. The ground held, slick but reliable, and they followed it carefully, keeping to the highest line, shoulders hunched against the rain, ears straining now as much as eyes, because the soundscape had become layered. Water still moving far below, wind threading through brush, and beneath it all, that steady mechanical presence sliding through the night. When the hum finally shifted direction, drawing closer instead of passing by, Evan stopped without warning, hand lifting, and they both froze, the noise resolving into something heavier, closer to the surface, accompanied by a faint rhythmic pattern that suggested motion over ground rather than air. And Lena felt a surge of conflicting instincts, to signal, to hide, to run. None of them clearly right, because they still didn't know what they were dealing with. The sound grew louder, then steadied, no longer approaching directly but moving parallel somewhere beyond the curve. And in that moment of suspended uncertainty, they understood that survival now depended not on strength or speed, but on restraint, on choosing not to act until the shape of the risk revealed itself. And they stood there in the rain, soaked, exhausted, alert, letting the night pass just a little more of itself before deciding what came next. The sound drifted away again, never fully leaving, just thinning into the background like a reminder that the night was still active, still moving pieces they couldn't see. And Evan waited longer than felt reasonable before allowing himself to move, because acting too soon had nearly ended everything once already. And Lena stayed close enough that their shoulders brushed when they stepped forward, not for comfort, but for calibration, using each other's balance to confirm the ground was still where it had been a moment before. The rain eased further, becoming a fine, persistent mist that soaked without noise, and that quiet made every other sound sharper: their breathing, the scrape of boots on pavement, the faint churn of water far below, all of it amplified by the absence of urgency, as if the storm were finished with them and now content to watch. They followed the road as it bent uphill, cracked but intact, and fatigue settled in fully now, heavy and undeniable, the kind that slowed thought and narrowed options. And Evan felt it in his legs first, a delayed response that made each step feel fractionally slower than the one before, while Lena felt it in her focus. The effort required to keep scanning edges, shadows, textures, growing steeper with every minute. They paused again, not because the ground demanded it, but because their bodies did. And in that pause, the vulnerability returned, the awareness that if something changed suddenly now, they would not react as quickly as before, and that awareness forced them to move again sooner than comfort allowed. The road opened briefly into a wider stretch, exposed to the sky, and there Lena noticed how the mist carried light differently, reflecting a dull glow that didn't come from the moon or stars, but from somewhere ahead and below the horizon, faint, intermittent, and impossible to place. And that glow tightened something in her chest, because it suggested proximity to something human-made without promising safety. Evan saw it too and slowed, weighing the risk of approaching versus the cost of staying where they were, because standing still had become its own danger, cold and stiffness creeping back in. And as they resumed walking, both of them understood that the next stretch would demand the last of their attention, because whatever lay ahead would not announce itself clearly, and the margin for hesitation had narrowed to almost nothing. The glow ahead finally resolved into shape as they reached the crest of the rise. Not a single source, but a cluster of muted lights smeared by mist, steady and low. And with it came the unmistakable sound of tires on wet pavement, slow, cautious, repeating at regular intervals. And Evan stopped them both with a raised hand. Not from fear this time, but from disbelief. Because after hours of negotiating ground that refused to stay put, anything orderly felt unreal. They stood there, rain beating on their jackets, listening as the sound grew clearer, the rhythm of an engine idling, then easing forward, and when a vehicle emerged from the curve below, headlights dipped to avoid glare. It did not rush, it did not swerve. It simply existed, solid and intentional. And Lena felt her knees weaken in a way the water had never managed, because the night had finally offered something that did not require guessing. They didn't wave at first, didn't shout, because the driver saw them anyway, slowing to a stop well before reaching the broken section, hazard lights blinking into the mist, and a voice carried through the rain, calm and measured, asking them to stay where they were. Evan answered with a raised arm and a nod, his throat tight, words unnecessary now, and as the vehicle door opened and boots met pavement, the ground felt different again. Not firmer, but shared, the weight of another presence changing the balance of the moment. They were guided a few steps farther uphill, not hurried, not grabbed, hands hovering close without touching, and only then did Lena realize how carefully they had been handled, as if everyone understood that the ground still demanded respect, even now. They were wrapped in blankets that felt absurdly thin and impossibly warm at the same time, ushered into the shelter of the vehicle, doors closing with a sound that made Evan flinch before he laughed quietly at himself. And as the engine pulled them away from the edge, Lena looked back once, watching the road disappear into mist, knowing exactly where it would fail again when the rain returned. Neither of them spoke for a long time because there was nothing left to decide, nothing left to measure. Only the steady movement away from the place where waiting had nearly cost them everything. And as the lights faded behind them and the road ahead finally held, they understood that survival hadn't arrived as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet transfer of responsibility from the night back to the world. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.